Вітаю, друзі! Ви на каналі UAFP Live. Мене звати Ірина Прокоф'єва. Ми продовжуємо серію наших подкастів. І сьогодні він буде трошки в незвичному форматі. Але персона, з якою ми говоритимемо про те, як Україні якнайшвидше приєднатися до Європейського Союзу, дуже для нас важлива. Це Хьюг Мінгареллі. Він колишній посол Європейського Союзу в Україні. І нашу країну він полюбив задовго до того, як приїхав до нас працювати. Отже, розмова буде англійською мовою, втім ви можете скористатися опцією субтитрів на нашому каналі. І дивимось. Okay, let's start, maybe. You was an ambassador in Ukraine, and I know that you liked our country. How different is Ukraine today compared to the time when you served an ambassador?
Well, your country has changed a lot over the last 30 years. Since its independence in December 1991, and it has changed for the better. There has been a lot of improvement in many areas, but over the last 12 years, almost now, your country had to face military aggression from the Putin regime, and it's clear that this aggression had a number of impacts on the country itself and its society. To be very brief about that, first of all, since now the full-scale invasion of February 2022, more than 6 million Ukrainians had to leave the country. You have more than 5 million people who moved from eastern Ukraine to the western part of the country, IDPs. You have as well a tragic death toll, because many people have been fighting to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine, and therefore there are in many sectors of your country a manpower shortage. And this is something which has changed a lot over the last 4 years. This is the first point. The second point is that due to the constant Russian bombing, a vast part of the critical infrastructure of the country has been destroyed. And finally, there has been as well since 2022 a devastation of the environment, what you call in Ukraine an ecocide. And this is a big change as well. But I don't want to be too pessimistic and to say that there has been as well some positive consequences. First of all, many people have been telling for decades that Ukraine is a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural country, which is true. But the Putin regime aggression, in my view, has strengthened the national identity of the whole population of the country. And this is, for the future of the country, very important. A second point, in Western Europe, you know, Ukraine did not exist a bit more than 4 years ago. I insist in Western Europe, not in the EU in general, because in the Nordic countries, in the Baltic states, in Central Europe, people knew about Ukraine. But if you go in countries like Italy, France, Germany, Spain, Ukraine was not on the mental map of many people. Now, with this tragedy, people know that Ukraine is a big country on the European continent with up to a few years ago, more than 40 million people. And therefore, this is as well, in my view, something which is positive. And last positive thing, well, you have now an EU membership perspective. Up to 2022, I can tell you that, because as an EU bureaucrat, I have been living this for 30 years. For the political leaders of Western Europe, again, Spain, Italy, Germany, France, all these countries, Ukraine had no EU membership future and perspective. It was absolutely sure. And Unfortunately for Ukraine, it has been necessary for you to leave this tragedy to get this EU membership perspective that the Ukrainian people had been asking for since 2004. Because when you elected Yushchenko, one of the reasons why the Ukrainian people elected Yushchenko was to get closer to the EU, because this was the main point on Yushchenko program, I remember. But for 20 years, until 2022, in Western Europe, political leaders did not want to hear about that. Now, you have an EU membership perspective since June 2022. So this is as well, in my view, a positive aspect of this Russian aggression.
Yeah, but now we have Hungary. Okay, maybe in April next year, Orban will not be elected.
It may change, yeah, it may change.
Actually, speaking about the war, how was the war in Ukraine reshaped role of the European Union in the global politics and international security?
Well, over the last few years, our geopolitical landscape has totally changed. It's clear that the rule-based international order, which have been in place over the last since the end of the Cold War, since 1991, has collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russian, the Putin regime has managed, in my view, to destroy the European security architecture, which was based on the UN Charter principles. And therefore, this total change of the geopolitical environment has led the EU to focus more and more on security and defense-related issues. Since its creation, the EU has very much been focused on trade, economic cooperation, people-to-people contact, all these elements which made the EU a soft power, able to impose, to spread norms and standards. But now things are changing to a large extent due to this Russian aggression against your country, and the EU has to focus more and more on security and defense to ensure that the EU can rearm itself, to bolster its weapon industry, to find no new sources of funding for weapons, drones, satellites, and therefore there has been a huge change in this regard in the EU, due once again triggered by this Russian aggression on Ukraine. Security and defense is now a key priority for the EU.
Actually, I feel that in these 2 days in Brussels, that European citizens, I would say like that, feel the Russian threats here. Even European citizens, not a politician, of course, but even citizens.
Alors on this, I would be less clear than you have been. Again, in the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, there is no doubt that the citizens are perfectly aware of the nature of the Putin regime and the Russian threat. Same apply to the 3 Baltic countries. The same apply to some Central European country like Poland.
Mm-hmm.
When you move to Western Europe, it's not that clear. You have still a lot of people in Italy, in France, in Spain, even in Germany, who consider that Russia is not really a threat for them. And therefore, even political leaders, you have a lot of pacifist people in countries like Italy. In France, you have still constantly political leaders who say that Ukraine has to be a bridge between Russia and the EU and nothing more. And therefore, I would be a bit less optimistic than you regarding the awareness of the political circles and the public opinion in Western Europe about the need for us to fight for the sovereignty of Ukraine, because Russia is a threat not only for Ukraine, but for the whole European Union.
Ukrainian government and European Commission states that it has successfully completed screening and it's ready to open negotiation clusters by the end of the year. How do you assess Ukrainian progress?
The situation on this aspect is, for me, rather clear. Ukraine has been able to complete the screening exercise in a record time, without any doubt. Ukraine has been able to adopt the 3 roadmaps required by the Commission, the roadmap on the rule of law, the one on the reform of the public administration, and the roadmap on the functioning of democratic institutions. In addition to that, Ukraine has been able to present an action plan on national minorities. And therefore, they have been doing in record time everything they have been asked to produce by the EU institutions. And the Commission said very clearly in the last enlargement package, which was issued a few weeks ago, that all conditions are met now to open talks on 3 clusters: the fundamentals, the single market, and external relation, which is, in my view, fantastic, because Ukraine has been able to do that while at the same time waging an existential war against its neighbor. So this is fantastic, in my view.
At this stage, what the key barrier to open full negotiations? Political will or technical readiness?
It's not technical, it's political. You mentioned already the fact that Hungary under Orbán and Slovakia under Fico will do everything possible to delay the opening of the negotiation. But what we can do, and what they are doing already, is that even if they cannot open officially the accession talks, de facto, Ukrainian people and EU bureaucrats work to ensure that Ukraine take over the acquis communautaire in a constant way. Ukraine can already align its legislation with the core body of EU norms, standards and regulation without opening officially the negotiation. And once they have been able to remove this obstacle, which again has been imposed by a few people, Orbán, Fico, Ukraine will have already made significant progress in taking over the acquis communautaire. So, in my view, this is a problem, but this is not a drama.
Okay. But actually, to be honest, we have an eternal problem in our country. Last corruption scandal, maybe you know about them. I would like to ask you, in your opinion, which Ukrainian institution require the most fundamental transformation to meet EU standards?
Okay, alors, first of all, when the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, I remember that all new independent states had an extremely corrupted society. It was a legacy of the Soviet Union. Bon. And in the 90s and the first part of the 2000s, unfortunately, there was no real will in Ukraine to fight corruption. On the contrary. But since Yushchenko, and in 2004, and in particular with the arrival of Poroshenko in 2014 as a president, a lot of progress have been made in Ukraine to fight corruption, with the establishment of anti-corruption bodies like NABU, SAPO, NAPC, with the establishment of the legal framework which allow this institution to fight efficiently corruption, and therefore a lot of progress have been made. But there is still a long way to go, and the focus should be, in my view, but not only in my view, in the view of all people who know a bit Ukraine, on the reform of the judicial system. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt that integrity, capabilities, independence of the judges in Ukraine remain weak. And therefore, it will be necessary, as soon as the war is over, to speed up the reform of the judiciary, and in particular, to focus on the Public Integrity Council, the Constitutional Court, the High Anti-Corruption Court, and the Prosecutor General. This institution will have to be reformed to ensure that judges and prosecutors are increasingly independent and competent.
It's the only one reform that Ukraine still underestimating, in your opinion?
No, there are other reforms that Ukraine will have to continue without any doubt. The modernization of the public administration, decentralization, land reform.
Land reform?
Land reform. Yeah. So that
we already had it.
Yes, but it's necessary, in my view, if you want to exploit the outstanding capacity and resources of your agri-food system, to continue to promote land reform. The reform as well of the governance of state-owned companies. This will be important. Privatization. It will be necessary to speed up privatization. Mm-hmm. So there are other reforms, but in my view, the priority of the priority should remain the judiciary for political and technical reasons.
Actually, land reform, agriculture sector is a huge problem for our neighbors. They're afraid of Ukrainian landlords, like we talk about them, and even small farmers. It's a competition, and we want to be partners with Europe. In your opinion, how we can provide this?
Alors, as you know, since 2017, Ukraine has been implementing an association agreement with the EU, and under this association agreement, you have what we have called, in horrible terms, but you, as bureaucrat, we use terrible terms, the deep and comprehensive free trade area, the purpose of which is to promote gradually the inclusion of Ukraine, the integration of Ukraine in some sectors of the EU single market through regulatory convergence. And a lot of progress has been made already since 2017 in this area. Bon. Recently, this DCFTA has been updated. I think that they have finished to update it at the end of October this year. We continue to promote trade liberalization, but there are two sectors which are particularly sensitive. First one is obviously agriculture. And in order to avoid creating social protest in the EU, and when I say in the EU, it's not only in Poland, but the same apply to France or other countries, everywhere in the EU, limits have been set to the import of sensitive agricultural products such as wheat, maize, poultry, eggs, honey, sugar. So on a limited number of agricultural products, you have limit. And in addition to on the export to the EU market, and in addition to that, there are safeguard measures which can be activated if, for some of these products, because of Ukraine imports in the EU, a crisis happened. You see? And in the steel and iron sector, which is another economic sector of where the Ukrainians are very strong and can export a lot, there are safeguard measures as well, so that when the Germans say, we have a crisis in our steel sector, and in addition to that, we have a huge flow of Ukrainian products which increase this crisis, safeguard measures can be activated. But outside these two sectors, iron and steel and agriculture, in all other sectors, we are moving quickly towards full liberalization of trade between Ukraine and the EU, and the integration of the Ukrainian economy into the EU single market.
Yeah, like as said, one of our experts in Ukraine facility platform, Olga Trofimtseva, maybe I'm sure you know her, that it would be wonderful if Ukraine now has one quiet voice in the negotiations table when a European Union actually write this agriculture program.
I believe as well that we should promote what is called by many people gradual integration. And one aspect of this gradual integration is the participation of Ukrainian people in EU institutions, sometimes as actors, sometimes as observers, so that when the EU reform its common agricultural policy, because they have to do that, and the cohesion policy, Ukrainians can already bring an added value to what we are doing in the EU. And therefore, I think that you are right. It would be important to have already now, in the discussion which take place in the Council, in the Parliament, Ukrainian representatives to make sure that Ukrainian interests are taken into consideration when we reform some key EU policies.
Is there, in your view, an unspoken red lines in how the EU perceive Ukraine? In other words, which issues are member states willing to overlook as long as Ukraine is defending Europe from Russia?
As I already said, we should never forget that in Western Europe, in the western part of the EU, you have still an important part of the political class of think tankers, of diplomats, and of the public opinion, which is not convinced that it is in our interest to get Ukraine in the EU. Yes, I give you a concrete example of this. Last year, in June 2024, we had elections at the European Parliament. In the country I know best, France, 5 out of the 8 main political parties said we will oppose Ukraine accession to the EU. 5 out of 8. Not only the far right and the far left, as many people believe sometimes. No. Even some of the main political parties continue to say, we don't want Ukraine into the EU. I say this for the French, but it's not different in Italy, in Spain, and to a large extent as well in Germany. And therefore, there is still an ideological battle to wage if we want to convince a majority of the people in Western Europe that it is in our interest in the EU to get this country in our family.
Maybe it's our job, it's a job of Ukraine to convince some And what would be your suggestions? How can we do it?
You have this is a communication problem because, as I told you at the beginning of our discussion, in Western Europe, up to 4 years ago, a majority of the people didn't know anything about Ukraine. And you have to explain what Ukraine is about, a country with outstanding potential in all areas. Nobody knows in Western Europe that Ukraine is the most digitalized society after Estonia on our continent. Nobody knows that the Ukrainian people have an innovation capacity which is fantastic. Nobody knows that you have a fantastic industrial tradition. And therefore, you have not to talk about the touristic potential, agriculture, all these things. So you have to explain in Western Europe what Ukraine is about, that you will not be a liability for the EU, but an asset for the EU. And that very quickly, Ukraine will bring a lot to the EU. In Western Europe, you have still a large part of the people, of the population, who consider that a nuclear power with a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, a superpower like Russia, has the right to have a sphere of influence in its neighborhood. And therefore, they consider that it is not at all a scandal if the Putin regime claims that they have to influence the domestic choices of Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, as well as the foreign policy priorities of this country. Many people in Western Europe still think in this way. And therefore, it is important to, as I told you, to wage an ideological battle to fight these ideas, to explain that Ukraine being a sovereign country, it's up to the Ukrainian to decide in which kind of society they want to live. A dictatorship like Russia or an open society with all the weaknesses that we have in Western Europe, first point. And second point, it's up to Ukraine to choose its alliances. If Ukraine were to join the EU, if Ukraine were to join the NATO, it's not up to the Putin regime to decide if they can or cannot join. But for that, once again, we have to convince a lot of people in Western Europe.
In this case, I would like to ask you about ongoing negotiations, peace negotiations. What do you think about that?
And as a European, I am a bit disappointed because when I see that the negotiation takes place between the Moscow criminals and some American business people, I say, God, in which world are we?
But we are in this world.
Yes.
No, it's for good.
The EU should be at the table because the future of Ukraine will determine the future of our security as well. And therefore, it is totally unacceptable that we cannot be at the negotiation table, first point. And second point, I would like as well to have in Washington, people reminding themselves that they are part of NATO, they are part of the transatlantic community, and therefore their main objective should not to make business deals, but to negotiate just and lasting peace for this important country, which has been under aggression for 12 years now.
In the final of our discussion, I would like to ask you, could Ukraine accession fundamentally change the European Union? For example, shifting it from primarily an economic union toward to more defense-oriented political alliance?
There is no doubt that Ukraine accession to the EU will change a lot. First of all, when we get in Ukraine, Moldova, we will have completed, and the Western Balkans, we will have completed the reunification of our continent, which is, in my view, an important step forward. First point. Second point, Ukraine will obviously strengthen the security of our continent, because those who are able to wage a war today are not in Western Europe. They are in Ukraine. And therefore, the security dimension of the EU will be strengthened with Ukraine accession. As I said a few minutes ago, there is in Ukraine as well an unbelievable innovation capacity of a large part of the population, and this will bring a lot to the EU. And therefore, I'm sure that Ukraine accession will change the EU for the better, will bring a lot to the EU. It will create as well some problems, but problems that we can address and solve through transition periods and through frank dialogue. No doubt about that. I don't want to be idealistic, but overall, Ukraine accession will bring a lot of positive things to the EU and will change our continent.
I do appreciate for this conversation, and I appreciate for love to our country, your love to our country. Thank you, Mr.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.